Hello, this is the Business of Meetings podcast, Eric Rosenberg, and today I'll be speaking with an amazing entrepreneur. He's built several businesses. He was twice in the top 100 fastest growing companies in Canada. He's been in events, he's been in training and speaking business, as well as in real estate, and he has so much nuggets of golden nuggets of information to share with us. I'm looking forward to speaking with Greg Habstritt. Welcome to the Business of Meetings podcast. I'm Eric Rosenberg, and today I'm speaking with an amazing entrepreneur, a friend that I met through MMT and Jason Gaignard. Thank you again. Greg has been one of the top entrepreneurs in Canada for many years. Two of the companies that he created were in the top 100. He's been in events, he's been in training, he's in real estate. He does a lot of different type of businesses. And most importantly, he is always ready to share his knowledge and help people. Greg Habstritt, I'm so happy to talk to you today. How are you?
Pleasure to be here, my friend.
Always a pleasure to talk to you. So you were kind enough when we had to react quickly when the COVID crisis started to participate in this webinar, Independent Business Owners, You're Not Alone. There's been a lot of people listening to that. Can you just maybe go back to it in terms of your experience in events and in past crisis, what happened and how you had to react, and especially these events with President Bill Clinton and also His Highness the Dalai Lama?
Sure. So yeah, my past life, I've always been an entrepreneur ever since I was, I dropped out of university at 21 to start my first business. And so since then I've been in a whole wide range of different industries. But one of the big threads through a lot of that is live events. And I got into speaking, being a professional speaker, doing a lot of travel and speaking on other stages, and also doing my own events. And because it's over such a wide time frame, so I started my events in 2000. So it's been 20 years, and so during that time, of course, we've seen a number of significant events that have had massive impact or consequence for the specific world of live events. And so I started my event career in 2000, 2001. And the first big event that I ever did was in 2001. And I had decided that I'm in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, and had decided that I really wanted to do a big event to try to put the city on the map, because I'm born and raised Calgarian, love the city, and it was never really recognized as an international city or destination. So I thought, who's the biggest speaker that I could bring in and put a big event on for? And this was in early 2001, and President Bill Clinton had just left office. And so he became available to speak. So I thought, well, there's no bigger name than that. So I decided we're going to plow ahead and try to get him to come and speak at a big event. And it was going to be a corporate event in Calgary. So
when was the event planned for?
In November 2001.
Okay.
And so in June, put the plan together. In July, we announced the event publicly after we secured Bill Clinton. We announced the event, got a whole bunch of ticket sales, and this is before the internet, essentially. I mean, it existed, but the idea of like buying tickets online, that didn't exist. So it was all you had to go to a website, download a PDF form, fill it out by hand, and then fax it in. That's how it had to happen. So anyway, we generated enough ticket sales to pay the deposit for Clinton to come, and the deposit to secure him was a six-figure check. Did I mention this is the first event? This is brand new, so it was a little nerve-wracking. Wrote the check in August and sent the check in. Everything secured, perfect. Ticket sales were continuing on. Calgary is an oil and energy driven marketplace, which also means that it's a fairly conservative jurisdiction, which means, of course, Bill Clinton, there was a lot of political pushing back and forth. It was kind of funny since he's a Democrat. So ticket sales were going along, and an event called September 11th occurred.
Yeah.
in September.
Yeah.
And it took a couple of days for me to even sort of wake up from what was going on because of just it was, unbelievably difficult to even fathom what had happened. But a couple of days after, the clouds started to settle down a little bit, I realized there's no way President Clinton's going to get on a plane and come here anymore. And it was in the time I can literally remember a time when there's nobody's ever going to fly again after this. Like that was sort of like the common belief that nobody could imagine commercial airlines ever coming back. And so I thought, well, we're in trouble now because we've already put the deposit down, but hopefully he cancels if that's what's going to happen, and at least we get the deposit back. So we can give the money back to these ticket holders. Because, of course, I had already spent money on marketing and signed a thing with the venue and everything else. And so we communicated with his office. It took about a week, but finally he came back and said, no, he's still coming. And I don't know, honestly, if the intent was that he figured we would still cancel, and therefore, because he was willing to come, that we would forego the deposit or forfeit the deposit. I don't know about the business politics of it, but the point is, he said, yes, I'm still coming. So we did an announcement in the paper. We did a press release, and we got a bunch of coverage locally, and basically said the President Clinton event was scheduled for November, and due to recent circumstances, a lot of people have contacted us. The good news is we've secured 20% more seating availability in the venue because now we believe his what he has to share is perhaps the most important thing we can hear as the former leader of the free world. So ticket sales popped again after that. And to make a long story short, we did the event in November, but it was scary because I think the thing that I took from that was having the courage to sort of step forward through the short-term fear and anxiety that was happening. And so to put it in a little bit more current context, a lot of people right now are canceling events that are 4, 5, 6, 8 months away from right now. And, in my opinion, I think that might be a little premature. For the next, 90 days, I think that's a pretty smart thing to do. But, if something's happening 6 months or 8 months out, people are terrified because they have this shock to the system that they believe that nobody's going to go to live events anymore. And I actually believe the reverse is true. I think when we get through this thing and life begins to slowly return to some sort of normal, there's going to be a pent-up demand for people who really want to connect, eyeball to eyeball.
I cannot disagree with that at all. I do believe that actually one of the silver lining of the current environment is that people realize how precious face-to-face meetings are and relationship, and all this thing about not social but physical distancing. Yes, there's this physical distance now, obviously for good reasons, and we've never had so many people coming together over the internet, speaking with each other and having meaningful conversation. Actually, much more than in regular life. Yeah,
no, I think we're going to see a rise in live events. I do think there's a place for virtual or online or remote or whatever you want to call it, but I think what we're going to start to see events do is a hybrid of the two. So they'll allow people to connect before the event, share the content a little bit more over a longer period of time, rather than expecting everybody to show up and hammering them with 3 days of nonstop content. Because I think what's going to happen is, and you and I see this at some of the events that we go to. So for example, MMT, the people aren't there for the content at all. I mean, what's on the stage is absolutely secondary. And that's why they're generally like, Jason doesn't rely on big name speakers to attract people, because honestly, and I'm sure you're the same, Eric, if he didn't have any speakers on stage, I would still go, because it's not about the content. So I think what this is going to do is force event planners and organizers and those who put together conferences and meetings, it's going to challenge them to really question, do we really need to have 9 hours of stage content like a fire hose? Can we maybe deliver some of that content over a longer period of time and focus on the community and focus on the connections and the networking while people are in the same room? Because I think we're going to put a much higher value on being in the same room as other human beings. So I think that's a positive evolution we'll see. But what I took away from the Clinton event was don't make short-term decisions, for long-term event situations. And because it's easy to get stuck and fearful and anxious about, like, again, the feeling of nobody's ever going to fly again. Like I remember that vividly. And of course that seems silly now, but so in 6 months, you don't know where we're going to be, and the world will hopefully return back to a normal. That doesn't mean, like, don't be monitoring, and in 3 months, if things aren't better, that you make the decision then. But I wouldn't make the decision right now. What I would be doing as an event organizer is I would be trying to figure out, how am I going to deliver maximum value between now and that event.
Absolutely. And I think as well for speakers, based on what you just said.
Yeah.
For speakers is not only to your point. I would go to the event of Jason, to MMT, even if there was no speakers on stage.
Yeah.
And what I realized as well, for all the conference I've been attending and will be attending in the future, that there are two things that are really striking me in terms of the content, if you want. The first one is, yes, I'm attracted when there's a big name, because I want to hear what that person has to say. And in terms of speakers, I think they have an opportunity as well to engage more with the community at the conference, and not just like, I'm arriving, I'm on stage, thank you, goodbye.
Right.
How can I provide more value? How can I be there a longer time? How can I really connect with people at the conference? And the second point is, I totally agree with you with that. I would go to a conference and basically spend more time in the hallway, because I'm meeting one person and then the other, and actually learning a lot as well, which is part of being there. And that part will never happen online. Never.
Right. And the content can be delivered online with about 90% effectiveness. I mean, people can watch the content and gain that kind of knowledge if they really want it on their own time. So I think we're going to place a much higher premium on people being in the room and utilizing that, rather than having them all stare in the same direction and not talk to each other. And
experiences at the conference itself.
Absolutely.
So what about the event that you had with His Highness the Dalai Lama? Because it's really unique to be able to organize a conference.
It was a unique event. So how that came to be was, this was in 2009, and of course the world was in the grips of a crisis at the time because of the credit meltdown, but it was kind of a slow motion crisis. Looking back, everybody knows what a horrible time that was, but during it, most people didn't actually feel the impact for quite some time. So, I can remember being on stage in 2008, I was in September, and I can remember telling people on stage that there's like a 50-50 chance that you're going to go out and try to use the ATM machine and your bank card won't work, because there was a run on banks. Banks were the real core problem back then. But for the average person, they didn't feel the impact from that for several months, if not a year or more. So for example, if you were in real estate or construction or investment banking, you may have felt that crisis a lot faster, like, in maybe in mid to late 2000 or early 2009. But for the average person, like if you were, almost any kind of service business, it took quite a while for people's discretionary income to start to slow down. So back then, I happened to be invited to sort of a mastermind group on Richard Branson's private island, on Necker Island. And leading up to that trip in May, that trip was in June, and in May, I saw an article in the local newspaper that the University of Calgary was sponsoring His Holiness the Dalai Lama to come to Calgary. And when I looked at what they were planning, it was sort of like this really Mickey Mouse little academic program that maybe a few hundred people might see him. And at the time, especially with what was going on in the economy, because, consumption and materialism and individualism was so high, because if you think back to the mid to late 2000s, everybody was like using their house like an ATM, buying big, huge houses, spending crazy amounts of money, buying expensive cars. It was all about, material wealth and consumption. And I thought, there's an opportunity here if we could get the Dalai Lama to share his message with a more business and corporate and enterprise
Right.
community, that might be an interesting thing. So I had reached out to them and said, would you be interested in having me build essentially a business conference around the Dalai Lama being in town? And they thought that was a good idea. So anyway,
Brilliant.
that's how it started. So then when I went to Necker Island, I talked to Richard Branson, and said, His Holiness is coming to Calgary. Would you be willing to come to Calgary and participate in an event there? And he said, well, sure, tell me more. And talked to his people, and that's kind of how it came to be.
That's awesome. Then you tell everybody else that you're
Well,
getting
yeah,
His Highness and Sir Richard Branson.
it's funny because when I look back, I mean, the speaker list that we had was just extraordinary. And aside from the two of them, we had Dr. Stephen R. Covey, who's one of my greatest role models and icons. I mean,
Yeah.
he actually spoke at a few of my different events, and he was a really, really incredible human being. But Stephen Covey and F.W. de Klerk, the former president of South Africa,
Africa, yeah.
who freed Nelson Mandela.
Nelson Mandela, yeah.
Brennan Burchard. It was one of the first speaking events Brennan Burchard ever had. Our friend Garrett Gunderson. It was one of the first times Garrett was on a big stage.
Wow.
There were about 30 speakers, and it was funny because, like you say, once you have the Dalai Lama and Richard Branson speaking, everybody wants to speak on that stage.
Yeah.
So from an event perspective, it was kind of fascinating because I had everybody pitching me on why they should be on the stage. So that event, again, I sort of planned it in June. The event was in late September. So I only had 90 days to basically pull off what was one of the biggest events, in the industry. And it was harrowing, but it was really incredible. So it was a 4-day event. We also had like a concert lined up with Bryan Adams and Katie Lang. And it was extraordinary. And
I was going to say, was it in the summer of '69? But I thought, no, I can find a better joke, right?
Yeah. No, it was absolutely incredible. I mean, it was very difficult to pull off, but I'm glad I did. And even today, like it's funny. Almost anybody that spoke at that event, if you read their bio now, it will say a phrase, something about, and has shared the stage with the likes of Richard Branson, His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Like if you ever see that in a speaker's bio, that means that they were probably at my event, because it's one of the only times a public speaking event where the Dalai Lama and Richard Branson appeared together. So it's kind of funny. So I still know a lot of people from the event world. And so that was interesting. But again, I think the lesson I learned from that one is when we first initially promoted that and announced it, ticket sales were pretty slow. And it was because I think we relied on the big names to draw lots of people. And what it taught me is that in live events, even if you've got a really big name, that's not enough. And I think that has really become even more true today, because I have friends that are organizing events with people like Richard Branson or Grant Cardone or different, big names out there that have huge followings, or Gary Vee, people like that. But if that's all you rely on when you put your event on, that people are going to come simply because of the name of the speaker,
No.
you can't do that, because the problem is people have so much access to content and material elsewhere that they're not going to pay $200 or $300 to sit for an hour and listen to a particular speaker.
Absolutely.
So you have to pay attention to the experience and what's going to happen and the value proposition. And again, it's related, but it goes back to the point we talked about earlier, that you've got to build in more value than just the time that they're actually sitting in the room.
Yeah, I'm listening to you. I'm thinking, okay, speakers, depending which context, might be extremely important or not at all. Content for sure, but speakers and the content is one for me. Then speakers, experience, and community.
Yeah.
And if you have those three elements, that you have a winning cocktail for your live event.
Yeah, and in the past, I think a lot of people have tried to get away with the community, not really focusing much on the community. It just sort of happens. And I think you really have to curate that and really plan that out properly. And you can hyperactivate people in advance through a lot of the virtual and remote engagement that you can do. You know, we've seen Zoom explode over this last month,
Absolutely.
of course. And now people are organizing their own little Zoom meetings. And I mean,
Yeah.
I did, for example, and I posted on my Facebook, and I don't have anything to sell. I don't have any particular topic I want to cover. And, a dozen people show up, half of which I've never met personally.
Yeah.
But the feedback that I got from that was just so incredible because people are like, well, do you know what? A couple of people asked me, do you know any more meetings like this that are coming up? Because it's just so great to connect with other human beings.
Absolutely.
So I think that's going to be a tool that is so powerful for business owners going forward.
And I'm amazed that, quite frankly, they didn't crash with all the people that have been
Yeah.
using at the same time. And my two little kid, they're not little, but the smallest one, if you want,
Yeah.
start having class on Zoom, and my other
Yep.
one as well. But the little one, who's 10 already, she came the first day and she said, Dad, I created my own Zoom account. So
Yeah.
in between classes, I can reach out to my friends.
All
And by
right.
the way, because I'm the host, I can mute them. So she
Actually, I
got
should
it.
tell Cooper about that. Actually, because my son's Cooper, he's actually turning 12 next week,
Yeah.
and he's on computer a lot right now, just because that's what they're doing to talk to friends. They use Google Hangouts. That seems to be like what their standard is. But I never thought about if he creates the room, he'll like that because there's certain friends that do a lot of talking.
No, they understand technology quickly. It's just
Yeah.
amazing. So you go through several crises in your business life. And I would like to talk a little bit about what you did afterwards when you built Trusted Authority, what happened, what the idea came from. And when we have accomplished that, then I would like to end our conversation later in this podcast with what you're doing next. And I know having the mindset and attitude is very important for you. So back to after those amazing conference, there's the economic crisis. What do you do? And especially give some inspiration to people listening, independent business owners. There is a crisis. There's something happening. What are some of the steps that you took that can be inspiring people today?
Yeah, when we went through the '08 downturn, it was particularly painful for me. At the time, we had about $100 million of real estate that we owned and managed with various partners, that kind of thing. And that crisis came, and when it happened, and I said before that if you were in real estate or finance, you felt it very quickly.
Right.
I felt it very quickly because we had development projects that were underway. We had, raised capital, $5 million capital to buy a piece of land in an area that was like one of the hottest areas in North America for development, which is here in Alberta. And it was just going to be a no-brainer. Like, it was going to be so easy. We bought that about 6 months before Lehman Brothers went down, and the skies were all blue and beautiful. There was no risk or bad things coming down the pipe, and couldn't lose. That's where we were at that point. That was my mentality. And then the banks started to fail, and the biggest issue back then was the banks didn't trust each other. So they were cross-collateralizing a lot of debt and packaging up, the mortgages, and some were good, some were bad, and trying to sell them to other lenders and institutions. And they stopped trusting each other. So nobody would lend each other money. The Fed had to step in and pile tons of money into the system just to try to create liquidity. And what's amazing to me, to give you an idea of the scale of what's going on right now, the U.S. Administration has done more financially in the last 2 weeks than they did the entire time of the '08 crisis over the course of 2 or 3 years.
Wow.
So the scale of what's going on right now is absolutely unreal. I mean, in the first 2 real serious weeks that we've had through this, unemployment applications is something like 8 or 9 million people right now in the U.S. in 2 weeks. So, and it's just starting to happen. So we've got a wave coming at us, and I think the difference this time is people can feel it because they're already seeing it in a lot of their friends and family. A lot of people that own businesses are feeling it. Now, if you happen to be in a certain kind of business, you might actually not be getting hurt right now, and you may actually have, a better business, right? I mean, if you're in events, you're probably in a tough space.
No doubt.
But it's interesting. I mean, I've got a friend. I think we have a mutual friend who owns both a restaurant and a bakery.
Yeah, Alon.
And his restaurant, I don't think his restaurant's going to survive. But yet, on the other hand, his bakery is up 40-50%, and he can't produce enough product. And so that's, I think, the hard part about this particular downturn is it's completely by chance whether or not your business is facing like critical, severe issues or minor issues or no issues, or you're actually doing better.
Can I interrupt you just on that for a second? Because I think that's very important for those who are listening that had to furlough or lay off people. That doesn't make them bad managers.
At all. This has nothing to do with whether you're a good or bad manager or business owner or planner. Anybody that says they could see this coming is a narcissist or a liar. Yeah. There's just absolutely no way you could have predicted this to occur. People point at the Bill Gates video from 5 years ago and talk about how he predicted all this, but
how many people build business based on that video?
And how many people make predictions like that turn out to be wrong? Right. And so you can't pick an outlier like that and look back in hindsight and say, oh, see, we should have followed this. So I really don't believe anybody could see that this was going to happen the way it's happened. Let's put it that way.
Agree.
So I think the number one thing, I mean, what I learned in the '08 downturn, like I said, I had a ton of real estate, a lot of development land that basically produced no income. I mean, land is the worst thing to own in a downturn, especially if you've got debt. Now, if you own it free and clear, then you just ride it out. That's what you have to do. And generally, time fixes almost every problem in real estate if you've got the staying power to stay in it. But where you get killed in a downturn is debt. Debt becomes the biggest problem. And so that's where I think a lot of business owners are going to have a challenge because, they've allowed their debt levels to get up fairly substantially, riding on the basis of like things seem to be okay. Yeah. So debt's going to be one of the biggest problems. Now, back then for me, the saving grace that I had was that I had this large real estate company, but I also had an operating business in the training and speaking and event world. And when the downturn came, it didn't really impact people coming to events as badly as what's happening right now. It didn't affect people that were buying online training. So I was still able to cash flow a lot of my real estate problems through my other operating business. But if you were just in real estate or just in mortgages in '08, '09, you probably went bankrupt. You probably lost everything. So my only saving grace was that I had a cash generating business to help me sustain through that period. Now, I barely made it. I mean, it was very, very painful. Ended up having to lay people off and a lot of the things that are happening today. But what I did learn from that, number one, debt can crush you in a downturn. And so that's number one, is to look at what debt levels you've got. If you've got credit cards that have balances on them, especially if they're high interest, that's one of the things to focus on. What we're going to see happen, I believe, is we're going to see a massive contraction of credit and lending facilities at the banks. Yep. And so I think, if it were me and I had an operating business right now, and let's say that I had a line of credit that I hadn't drawn on, or even if I had a personal line of credit right now on my house that I could draw on, I believe one of the safest strategies that you can take is to draw that line, take as much cash off of that line and debt as you can, and put that money away in a place that you will not spend it. And here's the caveat, Eric. What most people do, unfortunately, is they're not disciplined with their money. They will take, let's say, $100,000 from their business line of credit, even though they don't need it right now. They'll take that out, put it in a bank account, and then they'll think, oh, well, I think we're through the worst of it. So then they'll start spending that money. Nice. And now all you're doing is you're increasing your debt level. But the way that it works is that if you've got a $100,000 line of credit with a balance owing, and let's say the interest is 3 or 4%, that's one of the advantages of doing this right now is interest rates are so low. Right. So it's a very low cost to hold on to that money. Yeah. But if you've got $100,000 drawn on your line of credit, but you've got $100,000 sitting in a bank account, you don't have any higher debt level because your net worth is the same. It's still zero, right? You borrowed the money, but you put it away. Where you get into trouble is you borrow money and you spend it. And so what you're going to start seeing, and this happened in mass back in 08, 09, 2010, the banks just would take wide swaths of their business. They would basically shut your line of credit down to zero, not tell you, and then you would get a letter after the fact saying, we've done a review and we've adjusted your line of credit. Essentially, they've taken it away. They will not tell you they're doing this in advance.
I have some friends who lost their business because of that, because they were counting of that cash flow coming in, and suddenly there was nothing.
So in this kind of a crisis, the absolute rule is cash is king. It's that simple. Cash is like oxygen to your business. And if you run out of cash, your business goes bankrupt. Like there's just no way around that. So any chance you've got to get cash, have access to cash, I would take it. And the other thing to keep in mind is that if you take money against a line of credit, and let's say you put it in a bank account, but that bank account's at the same bank, the terms and conditions of your banking agreements allow them to go and sweep all of your accounts money. So that's the second thing that I would do, is to manage yourself carefully. If you deal with two different banks, and let's say one of them carries most of your debt and your line of credit, that kind of thing, and maybe you've just got a savings account at a separate, different bank, the next layer of protection is to take the cash and then actually move it out of arm's reach of the bank that has the debt covenant on you.
You have no idea how much I learned that the hard way 12 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. Ask me how I know all this.
And we're still here. So going back to that moment, basically your training, speaking business allows you to maintain both businesses at the end of the day. So what happened with the training and speaking at that moment? You're thinking, okay, how can I develop that? Or just by looking at it? Or you say, okay, I really need to develop that business now because the rest is kind of frozen for the moment.
Well, I focused on it because it was the lifeblood of me surviving.
How did you focus on that?
So my business, I had two sort of primary businesses within the training and speaking world. So what I would do is I developed a whole sort of series of different training programs. For example, one of the brands was the Trusted Authority. So I would teach you how to become the trusted authority in your market. And I would do that through a series of, I did a lot of content, video content, a lot of the kind of marketing you see now. And then I would sell an online program. And I would do partnerships with a lot of the, the bigger names in the industry. And they would promote my training to their audiences and get paid a commission. And so I would sell, we would do an online launch of a training program and might generate $1 million or $2 million in sales. Then once we did the training program and we ran them through the training program, we would then also offer a live event where you could come and actually take what you've learned and apply it, and I would be there to help you. We also offered things like higher level masterminds where a group of 12 or 15 people would, and it was a higher investment, maybe $15,000, and they would come to meet with me every 90 days. Typical of your traditional business mastermind. So we had these different layers of different training events and coaching programs that we offered, and then we also had the other side of doing live events, of doing more public live events. So specific around topics that I was known for, and then those would become places where people could come and learn more about me and my content, and then they would get into the training. And so it was sort of a lead generation process. And then we also did a lot of affiliate marketing for other people, because at one point, when I shut the training business down, my email list was about 140,000 people. Wow. And I had a hyper responsive email list because people liked me, they trusted me. And so in the industry, I was known as having one of the best lists. And so I could send an email out to my list and say, a friend of mine, let's say Eben Pagan, for example, is doing a program. He's fantastic. I could drive $100,000, $200,000 of sales through my list because they trusted me. And I only promoted things that I actually believed in that were good quality. Right. So that business I grew, 08, 09, 2010, because in the worst Yeah,
environment.
during this whole
Yeah.
downturn. And again, I think the advantage we had was that it was a little bit more of of a slow motion downturn as opposed to what we're seeing right now, which is such a
Mhm.
shock.
Right.
But we did continue to grow it. And so in 2010, 11, I mean, things started to get more and more difficult. So we were still growing, but we were going against the wind. And where I really felt it, there were a couple of things that I really felt. One was it was difficult to get people to come to a live event, mostly just because of the expense. Because as discretionary income started to dry up, people couldn't justify, well, flying all the way to Calgary from Fort Lauderdale, wherever they were, paying for the airline and the hotel and all
Mhm.
food and all that. So it became expensive to travel to an event back then. That was one thing. But the other thing that happened was that because of the credit crisis, whacked so many businesses, credit card processing online became very difficult. So the credit card merchant companies and the processors looked around and they started basically blacklisting entire swaths of industries. So, for example, if you were selling coaching and training online and you were collecting money up front but not delivering immediately, so let's say you signed up for a 6 month
Right.
coaching program, they were terrified because what happens if I collect the money and they give it to me and then I go bankrupt? Now they're on the hook because the client says, well, I never got any value. So
Wow.
they started clamping down on that really badly. And at one point, we got a letter from our merchant company, and we had processed about $10 million dollars through this company. So they knew who we were. We'd worked with them for 6 years. We got a letter that basically said, well, we're just, implementing some credit risk management strategies. So the next $500,000 that we collect from your sales, we're going to put in a reserve, in a trust account basically, and keep it there on a rolling 18-month reserve, which essentially
Wow.
means I stop, I'm selling, and one day, the next $500,000 of sales, I don't get that money. They put it in a bank account.
Oh my God.
And I mean, that's devastating to a business, obviously. So
Yeah.
I negotiated with them for months not to do this. And eventually they did it. And I was able to find another processor to switch to that would give us a little bit more leeway. But the problem is, this was happening everywhere. And back then, there was a big backlash against all the credit card processing companies because they started to band together and would only allow you to hold your one account. You couldn't have multiple merchant accounts. If you had another one, it violated that particular merchant's conditions.
Policy. Yeah.
So they made it very difficult. So that was another factor for me that I just thought, man, this is getting hard. And then the other thing is that because of the prevalence of technology and just, the market matured, there were so many people offering training programs and a lot of very similar products to mine, kind of
Mhm.
like monkey see, monkey do,
Yeah.
using a lot of the stuff I was doing. And I thought, it just, all of these things added up. And then, the other piece of it that had nothing to do with business was that at home, we had Cooper in 2008. And so he was getting to be 2 and 3 and 4 years old. And I just thought, man, I don't want to be one of those fathers. I always promised that I wouldn't be on the road all the time. And I found myself, one month I was on the road 3 weeks out of the month. And I thought, this isn't cool. And back then, switching to virtual really wasn't an option because the technology
Right.
wasn't advanced. And the biggest thing was bandwidth wasn't there, right? Like in my house right now, I've got a 600 megabit connection. I mean, back then you had to be a bank to get that kind of a connection, and it was probably $25,000 a month. So now bandwidth is so easy to get, and we can get crystal clear video and have 50 people on a call. You couldn't do that
Absolutely.
back then. So I think
Mhm.
in hindsight, if all of that would have happened today for me, I probably would have pivoted my business and I would have moved to much more
Online.
online delivery.
Yeah.
But I didn't really have the option at the time. But that's certainly an option that anybody that it's in the event, if we haven't, beaten this up too badly already,
Yeah.
anybody in the event business needs to be really exploring how to move online in a big way, because that's going to be the footprint that's left behind this crisis in the event
Yeah.
space, is the kind of hidden value in virtual meetings and conferences and workshops.
Absolutely. So I think on that point, one day if Cooper is complaining, you can tell him that did all his studies without Google, so he should be respectful of that.
That's right. Yeah, we did it the hard way.
So you're talking about the crisis. You're talking about cash is king, pivoting,
Right.
looking at other opportunities. how do you do that in a moment where you've been furloughed, you've been maybe laid off, you had to lay off people that you love working with, and what kind of mindset do you need? What kind of tools and mental health tools do you need to be able to do that?
Well, I think what happens when people go through this kind of a crisis, the first thing you have to do is recognize that at the end of the day, and everybody's got their own beliefs, but I really truly believe that at the end of the day, the purpose of life is to love and be loved. And that maybe sounds a little trite, kind of given some of the complex problems that people are having right now. But the magical thing that's happening right now through this is the incredible blossoming of humanity. And where I'm seeing it is there's so much less judgment of other people. And a lot of the work that I do now, Eric, in terms of training and coaching and things like that, has to do with the fundamental issue. I really believe the greatest human challenge that exists is that we are born and indoctrinated into a world where we believe what other people think matters more than staying true to our own soul and our own heart. And the problem is it's really difficult not to do that. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you go back 10,000 years and you look at what was the single most important thing that the human species at the time focused on, and all animals really, it was survival. That's all that really mattered, was trying to survive and replicate so that you could further your species. That was in our DNA. That was in our instincts. And back then, survival was equal to acceptance, because if you were not accepted by your tribe or your family, if you were somehow rejected or left out in the cold, you literally would freeze, you'd get eaten by something, or you would starve.
You needed the others to survive. That's very well described by Yuval Noah Harari in his book *Sapiens*.
Exactly. And so like survival literally was the equivalent of acceptance. And so we have all of that ancestral hardwiring in us as human beings to begin with. Then we're born into the world and you're a baby, and everything you do elicits a positive response from the people around you. So you smile, you coo, you reach out, people reach for you. There's always somebody around. All of your needs are taken care of. And we start to realize that as we get older, like, let's say you're 2 years old and your mother or your father takes you to the mall or to a store and you scream because you're not happy. Well, in that environment, parents start to react a little differently to you, because now the parents are embarrassed that they've got that kid that's making noise, so they look at you angrily. Maybe they shout at you, maybe they spank you. And so suddenly your whole world is blown up because what's going on? And you realize very quickly that you have to behave and do and hide certain things in order to gain that acceptance that you crave so deeply. And that's why when you look at most people, when they do a lot of work on themselves and they start to try to figure out what are the things in my life that cause me to have these destructive habits, or why am I so triggered by this kind of a person, for example, most of those will trace back into your childhood. And, some people joke around about, oh yeah, your poor little inner child and things like that. I happen to believe, and I've done a lot of work myself, that's the secret to unlocking being authentic in today's world. And so when you go back and look at that, and as you grow up in school and you meet kids and now you've got friends, and if you don't act and talk and dress a certain way, if you don't treat other kids, like maybe the kid that everybody makes fun of and bullies, if you don't do it too, then you risk being put on the outside of that group. So we're indoctrinated into this idea of acceptance is so important. And I believe what happens over the course of our lives is there's this little question that's running in our head all the time. And it's subconscious. We don't know what's happening. And the question is, are you going to be yourself, or are you going to be accepted? And you're answering that question dozens of times a day. Like each of us has answered this thousands of times in our lives. And every time...
Are you going to be yourself, or you're going to be accepted?
Are you going to be yourself, or are you going to be accepted?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the basis of a lot of the work that I'm doing now, is that question, because I believe that as you answer that question and you choose to be accepted, it's kind of like you're on like a little path and you're given this choice. How are you going to answer it? And are you going to choose to be accepted, or are you going to choose to be yourself, right?
And
And
that's
every time
amplified by social media.
that's why we have epidemic levels of anxiety and depression and suicide. That's a big part of it, because most of what you see on social media is so untrue and so inauthentic. It's the best moments of people's lives curated. And so you watch that and you compare all of these perfect moments of other people's lives to your...
Why is she having a great life and I don't?
Yeah, your daily, often crappy day. This isn't fair. And so, but every time you make that choice, it creates like this little gap. And you're going to choose yourself or to be accepted, yourself or accepted. And every time you do that, you get further and further away from who you really are. And over the course of time, you have some kind of awakening where you literally, you can feel it, and you look up and you think, what the hell am I doing with my life? Like you suddenly realize you've gotten so far away of who you are, who you know you really are underneath all the armor and all the masks, that your soul's now you have to do something about it. And that's what I think some people call a midlife crisis. I don't like that phrase. I like to think of it as an awakening, because it's now you have the chance to start to rewire some of that. And so I think for a lot of people that get to that point where they're more concerned about what other people think as opposed to what they know is the right thing to do. So all right, so that's all, sort of theoretical and conceptual. I think most people, when I tell them that question, they say, yeah, I can totally see that. But
now, how do you apply it today?
Right. So let me give you an example. So a friend of mine, she owns a company that's in the hospitality industry, and she's got 15 staff, and she is known as being one of the kindest, biggest hearts, most amazing people that you've ever met. I mean, you just can't help but smile and feel good anytime you have an interaction with her. She just cares so much. And so she's got 15 staff. So I talked to her about a week ago. And most companies by this point have started to realize, okay, we've got to quickly respond to this. And she's part of the group that you and I are in. So most of the people in that group are being fairly proactive about making changes quickly.
Right.
So I talked to her and said, so where are you at with things? She's like, well, we've got 15 people. And I'm like, okay, well, how many of you laid off? How many of you furloughed? Well, no, none of them. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, what's your revenue? Did your revenue decline? She said, yeah, it went to zero. We don't have any right now because we have no business. And so I said, okay, but you've got 15 people still on payroll. Yeah, why? And you could see that she was afraid to make the decision that she knew that she should make.
Because what other people would think?
Because she was so afraid of what other people were going to think about her. And so I said to her, look, the bottom line is, if you don't make this decision now, you're not going to have a business for them to come back to anyway.
Yeah.
Plus, you're going to lose this business that you've been building for 20 years. So as much as it's difficult, you can't make these decisions based on judgment of worrying about what people are going to think. Any employee, if you go to them with the right message and tremendous empathy, they are going to understand given the circumstances we're in, especially if you've gone to zero.
Yeah.
It gets more difficult when you start picking and choosing between, well, if we've got 30 staff and we need to let 10 go, which ones are we going to let go? I do think a big mistake that people make is going and saying, well, we're just going to give everybody a 20% cut. Because inevitably in every business, you have top players.
Yes.
And you have mediocre players. And it's not fair. It's not a good message to send to your top players that they have to take a pay cut that's equal to the people that aren't the performers. And so I think, again, that's what people are doing is they're saying, well, let's give a pay cut to everybody across the board. And the argument to that, one thing is it's good for culture, right? The problem is it's not good for business. And so that's just one example of where this creeps into our business decision making. Because at the end of the day, your number one focus needs to be on what we talked about before, which is cash. That is oxygen.
Yeah.
And so you've got to make cuts hard. You've got to make them deep, because you don't want to do it 2 or 3 times. That's the second problem that most people make, is they don't make the hard decisions right away.
Yep.
They maybe let a couple of people go, or then like they do, like, oh, we're going to give everybody a 10% pay cut, or whatever the case might be. They're back 2 weeks, a month later, cutting more people, reducing salary even more.
The morale of the
and then what have you done? Exactly. You've actually made it much worse, because now you're communicating to people. You don't know where you're going. You don't know when the next cut's going to be, and they're not safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's what you've communicated.
Absolutely.
And with all the things that are going on with the government and a lot of the subsidy programs right now, the good news is we're not in a normal time that if you just laid somebody off, like maybe like 6 months ago, there's not a lot for them to fall back on. But with everything that's going on right now between mortgage deferrals and subsidies and that, at least there's a little bit more for them to fall back on.
Mm-hmm.
And, it's still not great. I mean, obviously, this is not something that anybody wants to deal with. But I think, so that's just one example where this mentality of not being authentic to yourself and doing the right thing and worrying more about being judged for it, that's going to be fatal in this period for a lot of business owners.
Greg, I really love everything you're saying. It's a lot of food for thought and great advice. I would like to end our conversation today with the last question, more towards independent business owners and people that find themselves on their own today, right. Whether they had a business and had to reduce to themselves, or if they've been furloughed, or if they've been laid off. What are your advice? What should they be thinking of, and what should they be focusing on for the future in terms of mindset, in terms of spending their time, and in terms of priorities?
So I think, once you've done sort of the tactical things of trying to obviously cut expenses wherever you can, defer expenses wherever you can, trying to protect your cash in the best way you possibly can, and now you've sort of hunkered down and we got to get through this somehow. I think the greatest thing that you can do right now is look outward and try to add as much value to other people in your sphere of influence as you possibly can. Mm-hmm. And that's what I've been doing. And it's incredible, the feedback that I get. And, a lot of people now are familiar with the Mr. Rogers quote that he often gets credited about, or referring to when he was little, and they would be watching, his mom and he would be watching something on TV, and maybe it was some kind of a disaster or whatever it was. And it was some tragedy. And his mom would always tell him, look for the helpers, because there's always helpers out there. And my advice to people would be to become a helper and focus on how you can help other people through this, because what'll happen is you gain confidence and peace in having better connections with other human beings. I think one of the biggest mistakes we've made as a species is we've gotten away from the idea of what real connection and real love and real humanity actually is. I mean, there was a study several years ago in the US, and one of the outcomes was that the average person had 0.6 really friends they could count on in an emergency. In other words, they didn't have one single person they could absolutely count on that knew had their back. And it's because we've allowed social media to get in the middle and pretend to be connection. But social media is not social at all. That's not what it is. And so that's what we're seeing is a rebirth of that, I think, through this crisis. And technology is helping with that, but it's true connections. It's not having 2,500 friends on Facebook or 10,000 LinkedIn contacts that you've never actually met in your entire life.
It's like having some money at the Monopoly game.
Yeah, it's all phony. So at the end of the day, this is really testing people in terms of the relationships they've got, but it's a great time to focus and invest in those relationships because a lot of people are struggling. A lot of people are isolating themselves. So what I would do is I would think really hard about who are the people that you really appreciate as human beings that you haven't talked to in 2 months, 3 months, 6 months. reach out to them now. What most people are doing is they're focusing on the 3 people that they know really well, that they already have a deep relationship with, which is great. You need to be doing that as well. But what I try to do is I try to reach out to 3 people that I haven't talked to for at least 2 or 3 months, like well before this crisis came, and just checking in and seeing how they're doing. And the feedback is amazing, aside from how you feel about being there for other people. But when you get out of your head, you stop worrying about your own situation, and it doesn't become so fatalistic if you're constantly worrying about your own situation. And as a business owner, think about who are the people that you have expertise and knowledge that you can help. So, for example, if let's say that you run a restaurant or you're a chef or something like that. Well, what are some recipes that people could produce at home and really love, and things like that. So use your expertise and give it away. That's the best way to have people connect with you and feel authentic. And certain businesses are still selling and making money right now, but for the most part, that's got to be a secondary thing for most people, because you have to be so careful with the message. Otherwise, you get seen as being insensitive, trying to sell things in this particular market. But don't believe that nobody's buying anything right now, because I know businesses that are thriving online right now. But a lot of them, it's because they were genuine and authentic, going to the market and offering help.
Yes.
One of the examples that you're familiar with is like Stephen Weaver. I would use him as an example.
Candle Lab.
The Candle Lab. He went to his clients and said, look, we're not selling you anything. We just want to let you know we're here for you. If you need anything, reply to us. And it was such a heartfelt communication to his clients that a whole bunch of them started ordering, because now they're ordering candles to their friends as a care package, right? He had no idea, he didn't even think that, but that's what's happened. And it's because he came at it from an authentic perspective. So yeah, this is not going to be a short-term crisis. This is here to stay. But I think staying connected with other human beings is the best thing that you can do right now, to keep yourself grounded and to ask for help when you need it.
And in the words of Greg Habstritt, the purpose of life is to love and be loved.
That's right, my friend.
Thank you so much for your time, Greg. Truly enjoy our conversation. And I look forward to seeing you again face to face as soon as possible.
Sounds good. Much love.
Bye-bye. Thank you again, Greg, for spending time with me and sharing all your knowledge. There's a lot of things that I've taken note, a lot of points. One is definitely looking into the fact that cash is king, diversifying the business. I love what you say about being yourself or being accepted, and looking to be a helper for everybody. And last but not least, what I think it's a beautiful quote that you said is, the purpose of life is to love and be loved. Once again, if you have any question, please let me know. If you want to hear about somebody specific, reach out to me through email, through the Event Business Formula Facebook page, or through LinkedIn.